Good morning, welcome back. Today is October 9th, and pay no attention to anyone in the background who is making her own video about gardening and watering stuff. But we are back here on the flower bestrewn deck to talk about what happened on this date in history. Well, it was on this date in 1635 that Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony due to his religious views, notably in regards to his idea about the separation of church and state. Now, Roger Williams left Massachusetts Bay and went on to found Rhode Island, one of the early colonies to support the idea. And because of this, and because of his other religious views, Roger Williams is often considered one of the early American Baptists. I don't know that Roger Williams himself would have considered himself a Baptist, although the Baptist name in England was not that well known at this point. It was the early 17th century when the Baptists first started appearing as a separate denomination. But again, looking at Roger Williams and his career, people have drawn that conclusion, and he's an interesting guy. In 1781, on this date, the British surrender at Yorktown, which effectively ended the Revolutionary War. I mean, there was still some stuff going on, and it took a while. It wasn't for 2 more years that they actually signed a peace treaty, but Yorktown was pretty much the end as far as the British concerned. That's when they surrendered to Washington. The British surrendered to Washington. Well, and speaking of Washington, it was on this date in 1888 that the Washington Monument opened for the first time. I never personally have been inside the Washington Monument. I've seen it, I've been around it a couple times, but I've never actually been inside it. Maybe you have, I don't know, but it opened for the first time on this date in 1888. And then almost 100 years later, it was on this date in 1986 that the Broadway musical Phantom of the Opera opened on Broadway. This is, Phantom and Music of the Night and all that stuff. And it ran for, well, actually in London, it ran for quite some time, and on Broadway it ran for quite some time. In fact, I think it only just recently announced its closing. So hundreds and hundreds, thousands of shows. We saw it here in Chicago, and have seen it a couple of times since. But yeah, opened on this date in 1986. Birthdays on this date include Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus, born on this date in 1859. He was a French Jewish artillery officer who was caught up in a scandal where he was fired or removed, or court-martialed, I think is the right word. And it turned out that he was court-martialed largely due to his being Jewish. And you have the Dreyfus affair, and one of the great French writers, Émile Zola, got involved and wrote a pamphlet called J'accuse, which is I accuse you in French. So yeah, it was an interesting moment in French history. In 1890, Aimee Semple McPherson, a very well-known American charismatic faith healer, born on this date. She was very popular in the 1930s, 1940s, going into the 1950s. And finally, it was on this date in 1747 that David Brainerd died. David Brainerd died at the age of 29. Actually, I don't know if he died at Jonathan Edwards' home or had been there for quite some time, but I know there was some talk for a while that that David Brainerd would be marrying Jonathan Edwards' daughter. Clearly that didn't happen. He died at the age of 29, and then Edwards published his diary. Brainerd had been a missionary of sorts to the Indians, and his diary served as an encouragement to a lot of individuals to both enter the mission field and to particularly evangelize the Native American community at the time. But he died on this date in 1747. So, okay, well, that's all I got for the day, October 9th. Let's get back to talking about Acts chapter 6 and, 5 and, what are we getting? 6 and 7. Acts chapter 6 and 7 today, talking about Stephen, the choosing of the 7, and Stephen's message in front of the Sanhedrin. So, let's get to talking about that. Good morning, welcome back. We're here today to continue our discussion of the writings of Luke. We're into the book of Acts at this point, following up Luke's first work, that is the story of the life of Christ, this gospel, and now we're into the second work where he discusses the role of the Spirit, the development of the proto-church, and in my opinion, how the gospel got to Rome. Today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 6. Last week we ended our discussion of the Ananias and Sapphira scene, that time when Luke explicitly tells us that Satan came in, kind of as Jesus had told Peter that Satan was going to buffet you, and then Satan has come into Ananias and Sapphira's discussions, minds, hearts, whatever. And then of course you had a scene, if you remember at the end, in verse 41, chapter 5, verse 41, the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. So again, this proto-church, this first century church, or this first year, really, this first year church, we're talking about here, now has gone, in a very short period of time, has gone from zero to, or I shouldn't say zero, from 120 members, what we would call members, to over 5,000 and growing every day. And so it's got a serious learning curve going on. And today we're going to read about how they dealt with one of the issues, okay? So beginning in chapter 6, I'm going to start with verse 1. I'm going to read the first 7 verses, and then we're going to kind of go back and talk about what's happening here and what it means for this proto-church, this first rendition of the New Testament church. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." This proposal pleased the whole group. They chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, also Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas from Antioch, a convert to Judaism. They presented these men to the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands on them. So the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Okay, so what you have here is a couple of interesting dynamics happening. Okay, first of all, you've got 2 at least, and there's certainly more, but you have 2 different groups of Jews going into the church. Okay, one of them are what they call the Hellenistic Jews. Okay, and the Hellenistic Jews are the Jews that have adopted the Greek language and culture. Now, it could be that for whatever reason they come perhaps from a richer family and they are raised up in Greek. More likely is that for whatever reason they're from another country, and they've emigrated back to Jerusalem, and now they're back there living. Okay, but there's a significant number of them, and so for whatever reason you've got these 2 groups. Okay, so you've got the Hebraic speaking Jews. These would be the traditional Jews that speak Hebrew or perhaps Aramaic at the time, and then you've got the Greek-speaking Jews. So you have a language barrier. And of course, if you have a language barrier, you have a culture barrier. But these 2 groups are coming together, aligned under following Jesus as the Messiah. And we mentioned earlier, talking about how there were no needy among them, that they sold land and distributed things back and forth. And clearly one of the things they were doing was feeding the widows, feeding the poor, okay? Now this is something that's very consistent with the Old Testament law. And I'm not going to go into all of the passages in the Old Testament to talk about this, but clearly they're doing this, certainly it's a good thing to do. Don't get me wrong. It's a very good thing to do. But it's certainly well within the parameters of the Old Testament law, commands for them to be doing this. And that's why they, first of all, set up this is what we should be doing. Because again, remember that the Jews at this point, in this proto-church, okay, the members of this proto-church, especially the Jewish ones, the Hebraic Jews at least, felt that Christianity was just the next step. Okay, it was just Judaism. Okay, it wasn't a new religion. It was just Judaism. We've just happened to make the next step. We've decided, okay, we've looked forward to a Messiah. The Messiah's here, and now we're going to do the next step. Okay. But when you bring these two groups together, and I don't know how large they are, but there's some friction that happens. Anytime you put two groups together, it's not unusual that there's going to be friction. And one of the friction results in the charge from the non-Hebraic Jews, that is the Hellenistic, the non-Aramaic, non-Hebrew speaking Jews, that their widows are not getting as much food or not getting the attention that the Hebraic widows are doing. Okay, so this isn't exactly a controversy or this isn't exactly dissension in the church in the same way that Ananias and Sapphira is coming in, bringing that in. But it is still an issue. It is still a conflict within the church that needs to be addressed, okay? It's not unlike, back in the Pentateuch where Moses finds himself overwhelmed with duties, and so his father-in-law says, well, you need to appoint some assistants to do this, okay? So it's kind of similar to that, okay? So, and we saw, like, when Joseph, Barnabas, sells his land and brings some money, and he lays it at the apostles' feet. And when Ananias brings in what money he does, he brings it in, he lays it at the apostles' feet. So that's kind of like, here, guys, that's, do with it what you want. And so the 12 apostles were part of, we're distributing, we're taking care of making sure that this went to the right place. And so clearly the apostles saw this conflict and thought, you know what? There's some legitimacy to this because we're not watching it well. We need to focus. We're distracted. We can't do this and that. Okay. So they say, so their solution is to the group. They say to the group, they bring all the disciples together. It's interesting. Now, is that the 120 or is that the 5,000? We don't know, but it's clearly a larger group of individuals. And they say, listen, here's what we're going to do. Pick out 7 men. Pick out 7 men, and we're going to, in 2022, we're going to offload this responsibility to them. We're going to delegate this to them. We're going to let them we are going to empower them. And in fact, one of the interesting things that the disciples, the 12, do, and coincidentally, they're called the 12 here, not to be confused with the 11 or again, one of the interesting things that the 12 do is they delegate the responsibility for picking the picking the 7 to the group. And then when the group, and so then the group picks the 7, and then they bring them back to the apostles, and the apostles, there's no indication here. Now, again, I'm just going with what the text says. There's no indication here that the disciples, that the 12 apostles looked at him and go, oh, wait, I don't know about this guy. Let's question him. It just says that the 12 or the crowd, the group brought these 7 men back and said, here, these are the 7 we want. And the apostles said, great, let's lay hands on them and pray for them. And boom, they'll empower them to take care of this. And again, this is a significant empowering because in order to do this, this meant giving up, giving away food. This meant giving away some of the finances. So it's kind of an interesting thing that this could be seen as power, this ability to pass out food. And the apostles right away say, you know what? No, let's let somebody else do that. We're going to focus on preaching the word. Okay, so they choose 7 men to do this particular task. Okay, and it's pretty clear that they're all men here. Okay, there's no explanation why. It just says they picked 7 men to do this. Okay, so this is just a fact. When they chose these 7, all 7 of these seem to be men. Now, it is entirely possible that 1 or 2 of these names could be female. Okay, we're just not that familiar with the names. I highly doubt it because I think that point would have been made by this time. But regardless, they picked these 7 guys, and the 7 are Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, Nicholas from Antioch, a convert to Judaism. Okay, so that last guy, it's interesting. That last guy, excuse me, Nicholas from Antioch. So, okay, he's a clear-on Gentile. Okay, now the other ones may have been as well. Okay, he's clear on. He was not born a Jew. Okay, not like all of the apostles were. And clearly that guy is a Gentile. So it's kind of interesting that early on, one of the first organizational decisions that these Jewish leaders of the church make is that we're going to delegate this responsibility, delegate this authority, delegate this power to these individuals who are not apostles, they're not necessarily Jewish. Okay, so, and they give this to these seven guys. Okay, now the interesting thing here about this, and one of the things that I found fascinating about this passage, is whenever we talk about this passage, whenever contemporary Western Christianity talks about this passages, these seven men are always described by a single term, and that is deacon. Okay, it's always said, oh, this is the choosing of the first 7 deacons. Okay, but what's interesting is that word is not in the text. They are not called deacons here. Okay, they're just called the 7 who are going to serve. Now later on, the concept of a deacon and the word deacon, diakonos, means to serve. And these are 7 men who were going to serve. And so it's very likely that later on in the development of the organization or the administration of the church, that somebody said, look, we need to have people in our church serving like those 7 were. And we're going to call them servers, which in the Greek is diakonos, and that's what they're going to do. Okay? But at this point, they're not called deacons. Okay, these are not there. So what that means to me, looking at this is not the church creating a church office at this point. I think that comes later. Okay, later on somebody does. Because certainly by the time Paul is writing in 1 Timothy, there is a church office. There is a position that if there's a certain number of believers in an area, you need somebody in charge of the serving, the distribution of food for the needy. Okay, there's an office. So by the time Paul is writing 1 Timothy, that clearly is there. Okay, and throughout and through the New Testament, there's several times, or not several times. The word itself, deacon, isn't used that often. It isn't used that often in the Bible, certainly not in the New Testament. Now there's times it's used, but it's not used that often. But be that as it may, so they've chosen these 7 guys. I could go on. To me, this is a fascinating rabbit trail, but I need to get back because I got a lot to do. So let's talk about one of these guys. Now, you see, these guys are not, they're chosen for their spirituality. They're chosen for their faithfulness. And it says, pick Stephen, and perhaps one of the reasons why Luke brings this story in is to just say, here's how Stephen comes to the surface, okay? Perhaps that's just an idea, all right? But it says now, verse 8 in chapter 6, verse 8, now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, and also his spirit and wisdom from the earlier text, okay, performed great wonders and signs among the people, okay? So again, he, through the Spirit, was able to do miracles, probably healing. Now again, Stephen is not a disciple. He's not an apostle. And yet the Spirit has empowered him to do these great wonders and signs, such that he becomes a lightning rod for attention. Opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia, who began to argue with Stephen. Okay, now it's a couple of interesting things here. Okay, first of all, we don't really know specifically what this synagogue of the freedmen is. Okay, we can draw a couple of conclusions. One is it's probably not something inherently Jewish. It may be something that these non-Greek speaking Jews, because if you look at who's in it, it says synagogue of the freedmen, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. Okay, so these these Jews are the non-Hebraic Jews. Okay, so not necessarily non-Hebraic Jews that are in the, that are believers. Okay, so it's kind of like these are Stephen's people, to me, to a certain extent. This is Stephen's crowd. This is Stephen's countrymen, so to speak, as opposed to just a Jew who was born and raised in Jerusalem. Okay, so they get in and they see Stephen rise to prominence within this group, and perhaps there's a little jealousy, perhaps there's a little anger, perhaps they just don't like what he's saying, and so they come out and they start this whispering campaign. Okay, so opposition arose, who began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against the wisdom the Spirit gave him as he spoke. Again, this is going back to, this is just an illustration of what Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, that when you're under attack, the Spirit will give you the words to say. Then they secretly persuaded. Okay, so now they're taking a cue from the chief priests and elders and, their prosecution of Jesus. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." Okay, so they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. Okay, so the usual suspects, right? Again, remember the teachers of the law, these are the Bible scholars. These are the ones that tried to end this all by orchestrating the death of Christ 2, 3, 4 months earlier. And of course, they're not happy that Christianity hasn't gone away. Again, they may be stomped out of the meeting in Acts chapter 5 when Gamaliel said, "Listen, it's going to wear out, it's going to wear out," and they're like, "We want it to wear out now," okay? So they produced false witnesses who testified, "This fellow never stops speaking against this holy place and against the law." Okay, so here, if you're a non-Hebrew speaking Jew, if you're a Hellenistic Jew, and again, this is my belief that that's who these guys are. I could be wrong on that. Again, it's not a hill I'm going to die on. But if you're in this essentially foreign area, and you want to get the natives of that area to be on your side, well, then you got to make it seem like this guy is against the natives of the area, and I think that's what they're doing. Oh, look at Stephen; he's always saying bad things about Jerusalem. Okay, they produce false witnesses that will destroy. They produce false witnesses who testify, "This fellow never stops speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us." Okay, so again, this isn't that difficult or different. It's kind of a modification of the accusations thrown against Jesus. Oh, well, he said he was going to tear down the temple, okay, and build it up in 3 days. Okay, so I think the way they would have said that back in Jesus, that this guy, he said he's going to tear down the temple and he's going to build it up in 3 days. Okay, so that is just like kind of just a toss-up, because there's no way you're going to build a temple in 3 days. Okay, it took years and years to build it the first time. Now, it is conceivable that with a big enough army, that you could destroy the temple if you had a big enough army. And if you didn't have a big enough army, there's no way you're going to do it. It just makes the whole threat absurd, which is what these Jews were arguing about. Okay. So for we've heard him say this. So they bring these charges against Stephen. Okay. All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin. So again, this is that ruling body that had, so miserably they had tried to get rid of Jesus. They had tried to get rid of Peter and John. Okay. Now they've got this non-Hebraic Jew standing in front of them, causing grief. Okay. All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. Okay, and I don't know exactly what that means, what that phrase means. I suspect it just, was he extremely handsome? Well, that could be, but I just think it just has to be like the demeanor, that he was just smiling. Maybe his face was glowing, and maybe literally glowing. I don't know. But there was just something about his look that, because again, if you see an angel, that should be a calming thing. I mean, I get that, when the angel of the Lord appeared, that people were falling on their knees, but I think in this context, they're just talking about the sheer confidence that he's got, just the sheer tranquility, just the sheer, I can handle this. This is no big deal, just full of the Holy Spirit, fully living in Luke chapter 12, what Jesus said, okay? Then the high priest asked Stephen, are these charges true? Did you really say that you were going to tear down destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us? Did you really say that? To this he replied. Now, I'm just going to give you a fair warning. Two things. Number one, Stephen doesn't really answer the question. Okay, maybe he took that lesson from Jesus. He never really answers that question. Okay, he doesn't need to for our purposes. Okay, Luke has already told him they're false charges. All right. But what he does do is he launches into a sermon. And just for the record, this sermon is the longest sermon in the book of Acts. Okay, so I find that fascinating that the longest sermon in the book of Acts is not from one of the apostles. It's not from one of the people who have been around Jesus. Okay, or apparently, I don't know. Maybe Stephen was. Okay, I don't really know that. Okay, but it's not from one of the apostles. Okay, so the longest one clocks in here at about 55 verses here, beginning in verse 1 or verse 2. And I'm gonna go through this because I think it's interesting, but I don't think we need to go to a lot of detail because I think the points that he makes are pretty obvious. Okay, so keep in mind the setting. There's false witnesses have said things about Stephen. Stephen, of course, is a recently, I don't want to say promoted or designated servant of the church, has a role in the church, he's well known, he's had tremendous success in the spirit. Then you have the Sanhedrin, who just really, really, really wants this group of people to go away. Okay, so you've got this, and the Sanhedrin has heard it, has gotten a tongue lashing from Peter and John, and I think they took some heat from what happened with Jesus. Okay, they didn't really get a tongue lashing from Jesus, but kind of a quixotic sort of thing there. But they really want this to go away. They really, really, really want this to go away. Okay, and it would be nice if Stephen would just say, "Yeah, I said it. What are you going to do about it?" But he doesn't. He launches into what essentially is a history of Israel lesson. Okay. To this he replied, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people, God said, and go to the land I will show you." Now this is just repeating what's in Genesis 12. So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are now living. He gave them no inheritance here, not even enough ground to set his foot on. But God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. God spoke to him in this way: "For 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated." Okay, now this is talking about Genesis 15. "But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves," God said, "and afterwards they will come out of that country and worship me in this place." Then he gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision. Okay, so again, going back to Genesis 12 through 15, and again, fascinating stuff there going on. Stephen is just kind of repeating this to the thing. Now, here's a question, and I'll make the statement now, and I'll repeat it again later. He's standing in front of the Sanhedrin. Okay, these are all religious leaders. These are all very well versed in the scriptures, in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh. Okay, why on earth does Luke include this? Why does Luke include, and anybody who's reading this, or any believer nowadays, we've got the Old Testament, and these Jews have the Old Testament. Why is Luke including this story that includes so much what we might consider extra detail? Okay, well, we don't know 100% why Luke included anything in any of his books, but I think there's a very good reason why, and that is that Luke's writing to somebody in Rome. Okay, again, how the gospel got to Rome, somebody in Rome. And it's very likely, quite possible, that whoever is in Rome doesn't have access to the Old Testament, or maybe he or she has access, but they're not as familiar with it as anyone else is. And so he puts Stephen's sermon in there because again, he's pointing out how the gospel got to Rome, and he's given this is like a huge background moment. This is sort of like a backflash in a movie, or a flashback in a movie, 2 years earlier kind of thing. And so Stephen's sermon here illustrates both a moment in time for this proto-Christian church, and it also serves to give a lot of background to anyone reading who wouldn't know all of the nuances of the law and things like that are going on in Jerusalem, okay? So, and again, he says, for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, God said, and afterwards they will come out of the country and worship me in this place, okay? And we know we're talking about Egypt. And then he gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision. And Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. We'll just skip that whole Ishmael thing right now, okay? Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs, okay? And Jacob, of course, his name was changed to Israel, and the 12 patriarchs become the 12 tribes, give or take a tribe or two. Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, this is interesting. They're not patriarchs when they're jealous of Joseph, but we're into the Genesis 37 through 50 now. They sold him as a slave into Egypt, but God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. Okay, again, go, Joseph. Okay, we know this story, but again, Theophilus may not. Okay, then a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering, and our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. Now they were patriarchs, now they're forefathers. On their second visit, Joseph told the brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father, Jacob, and his whole family, 75 in all. Then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and his ancestors and our ancestors died. Okay, so again, Stephen clearly is Jewish, okay, but he's Jewish from a different area, okay, so he's Jewish from Greece and he's moved back or whatever. So, but he's one of these Hellenistic Jews, I think, because he's got this Greek name. Okay. Then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our ancestors died. Their bodies were brought back to Shechem and placed in the tomb that Abraham had bought from the sons of Hamor at Shechem for a certain sum of money. Okay. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Now we're in Exodus. There arose a king who knew not Joseph. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so they would die. Now again, this is, Theophilus is reading this maybe for the first time. Really? Seriously? Okay. Again, we'll just forget that whole thing about, Herod and killing the babies in Nazareth. At that time, Moses was born. Okay. Now again, let's bring in Moses, because amongst the accusations, Stephen has been accused of saying that Moses, you're going to destroy that Moses changed the customs that Moses did. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was powerful in speech and action. Okay. Now this is true. Of course, it's interesting to contrast that to what Moses said in Exodus 4, where he says, please, I'm not eloquent in speech or whatever. And he says, well, take Aaron, your brother, to do your speaking for you, okay? And again, this isn't a contradiction, because you can have people that are not, have speech impediments or things like that, that can have a very powerful voice just in their writing and their leadership and how they deal with things. So again, it isn't a contradiction in that sense. It's just kind of interesting that, looking back, despite the fact of his feeling inadequate in speech, Stephen looks at Moses and says he was a man powerful in wisdom and speech. And of course, nobody in the Sanhedrin is going to disagree with him, right? They're going, yay, Moses, okay? When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses, and this is an interesting passage here, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. Okay, now looking back, we know that Moses was supposed to be the rescuer of Israel, the slaves. And Moses thought that these guys would realize, hey, I'm your guy, but they didn't. Okay, what did the people of Israel do at that point? Okay, the next day Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt one another? Okay, but the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So what do the people of Israel, and I think it's mentioned again later, but I'll make the point now. What do the people of Israel do here? They've been presented with their rescuer, and what do? They've rejected him. So we did all of that for all of that information that both gives background, but it establishes here the first time that the people of Israel rejected their rightful ruler. Okay, so Stephen counts that as a rejection. Okay, that's not clear from just reading in Exodus that you see it as a rejection, but looking back 1,000 years, Stephen is saying that was the first rejection. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Now, what's interesting here is that, taking Stephen's word, that Moses knew he was supposed to be the leader, so maybe he was just maybe Moses spent 40 years wondering when God was going to find him. You ever wonder that? But Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Okay? I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. Okay? This is the same, and now, okay, so I'm going to send you back to Egypt. Okay, now, this is Stephen. So that was Stephen quoting what God is telling Moses. Now we have Stephen speaking to the Sanhedrin. This is the same Moses they had rejected with their words. Who made you a ruler and a judge? Okay. He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. Okay, so again, we're still talking about Moses. Remember, the leaders had rejected him. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. Okay, so again, Stephen throws that in there. He throws it in there to say, hey, don't forget, Moses said that I'm going to raise a prophet up like me. Now, let's get back to the story. He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. Now, what's he talking about? These living words, okay? Again, you can go into the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, later in one of the other accounts. But still, what are the living words he's talking about? He's talking about the law. He's talking about the 10 Commandments. He's talking about Moses up on the mountain. God is giving him these living words, and he's going to come down the hill, and he's going to give the words that the finger of God has written into a stone. But our ancestors refused to obey him. So once again, here the second time that the nation of Israel has been presented with the words of has been presented with their deliverance, and they rejected him. Okay, they reject him. Instead, they rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. Okay, they told Aaron, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and reveled in what their own hands had made. But God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. Okay, this agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets.
did you bring me sacrifices and offerings? 40 years in the wilderness, people of Israel. You have taken up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god, Rephan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile. Okay, so basically what he's saying is this is the third time. Okay, so he says, look, they came down from the law. Moses brought the law down and the people rejected them. Okay, and that was a rejection. And then again, there's, he's kind of skipping a long amount, but he says basically that the exile, he's quoting from Amos here, the exile is another example of the people rejecting God's leader, okay, God's leadership, okay? Our ancestors had the tabernacle of the covenant law with them in the wilderness. It had been made as God directed Moses according to the pattern he had seen. After receiving the tabernacle, our ancestors under Joshua brought it with them when they took the land from the nations God drove out before them. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built the house for him. However, the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. Okay? And the prophet says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things? Okay? So he's talking about the temple. Okay? He's talking about, that he's kind of, this is kind of a side note. He's saying, now listen, you guys, David wanted to build a temple, but Solomon built a temple. But really, does the temple really matter? Does the temple really matter? Because he says, and this is in this is Isaiah 66. He said, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Okay, I don't need a temple. Okay, and this is to the Sanhedrin. This is probably being said in sight of the temple, or the temple is the actual, Herod's temple is very close to where this is going on. Okay, and this is happening right there. And so he says, so the people of Israel, those in Israel are probably, especially in Jerusalem, are very, very secure in their relationship with God because he's right over there. He's in that temple. And Stephen is like, wait a minute, temple, you don't need a temple. God told you don't need a temple. And of course, at this point, we know this is post-resurrection, temple ripped in twain, okay? So again, this is like a shot going, listen, guys, you don't need the temple, okay? So you're relying on something that God told you in the past that you don't need. You rejected God. You rejected God's leader in Egypt. That first time, you rejected God's leadership when he came down the mountain. You rejected God's leadership when you went into exile. You think you're hanging on to God's leadership now because you have the temple? Verse 51, you stiff-necked people. Okay, let's get back to the point here, Stephen says, okay? You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? Okay? You guys are sitting up there like you're the spiritual ones, and yet every time God sends a prophet, you reject him. And he's got this whole series of them, okay? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And what's interesting about this is this is a particular hang-up of Luke, okay? And what do I mean by that? Let's go to some of the statements in Luke. In Luke 4:24, Jesus is talking and he says, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. In Luke chapter 6, beginning verses 22 and 23, Jesus says, blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven, for that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. Okay? In Luke chapter 11, beginning with verse 47. Luke chapter 11, beginning with verse 47. What am I going to say here? Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what the ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Okay, because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles. Some of them they will kill, and others they will persecute. Okay, and then again in Luke chapter 13, beginning with verse 33, Jesus says, in any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day. Okay, this is the phrase where they say, Herod's trying to kill you. And Jesus is saying, oh, yeah, so what else is new, okay? At that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you. It says, but in verse 33, in any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets. Okay, so this is clearly a hang-up. This is clearly a pet peeve of the writer Luke. Okay, and here he's got, now you've got Stephen standing in front of the Sanhedrin, just kind of repeating the concepts in those 4 verses. You have always rejected the prophet. Okay, and then he gets to the point. They even killed the one who predicted the coming of the righteous ones, and now you have betrayed and murdered him, the righteous one. You have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. Okay, wow, this is heavy stuff coming from somebody who is not of the religious elite, talking to the religious elite, saying, you guys are just like your ancestors, consistently rejecting the truth of God when it's right in front of you. Verse 54 kind of answers the question, how did that work out for Stephen? When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. Remember, the Sanhedrin just wants this to go away. They just want to be done with this Christianity stuff. I mean, it's not called that at this point. They just want this whole Jesus stuff to go away. Can't this stuff just go away? Okay? And then now you got this guy, and they're just like, who do you know? And I kind of think that there's a crowd watching this. I don't think it's just, a closed session. I think there's kind of a crowd watching this, and they're all, the people who are there opposing Stephen are on the Sanhedrin side, okay? And they're just, everybody's just, But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God. Interesting that he opens his thing saying, the God of glory came to Abraham. And then Luke says, and now he sees the glory of God. So it ties the two together, that the same God who came to Abraham is the same God that Stephen is looking at now. Okay. And Jesus, looking up to heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. How does he know that? Look, Stephen says, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Okay, now, a couple of interesting things about this. First of all, it's the only time that somebody says, I saw him standing there. But it's also the only time somebody other than Jesus refers to Jesus as the Son of Man. Okay, so just kind of an interesting thought there. And but they know who he's talking about. How do we know they know who? Because look at their reaction. Okay, so he has just said to the Sanhedrin, and you killed God's Holy One. You have betrayed and murdered him, the righteous one. And they know, everybody knows they're talking about Jesus. And Stephen looks up and says, look, I see the Son of Man. And everybody knows that Son of Man means Jesus, standing at the right hand of God. Okay, so, again, going on, no man has seen God. There's this checks so many boxes in the Sanhedrin view of blasphemy. And they're so furious that they just start picking up stones. They covered their ears and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragging him out of the city, and they began to stone him. Now, is this a legal exercise or is this mob action? I don't know, okay? It's interesting. You got the Sanhedrin. They're clearly aware of what's going on, okay? One suggestion has been that because of Stephen's mixed or lack of strong connection to Jerusalem, that they're able to do this, that they couldn't, or to Israel, that perhaps there's something. Stephen is of some ethnic group, clearly of a different ethnic group, from Cyrene or Asia or something like that, somehow they know this, they can tell this, that they're able to do this because he's in a sense a foreigner. Okay, I don't know how well that works, but I think that here they're just so furious. They just so want this to end that they say, we just got to get rid of this guy. We just got to get rid of this guy. And they just pick up stones, like, maybe it's a mob action, maybe it's the heat of the moment. The fact of the matter is, they kill him. They kill him. And as they're running out, they're like, oh, we gotta get this ropes out. Here, hold these. And they give the robes to a guy named Saul. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. Okay. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Similar to what Jesus had prayed on the cross. And with that, when he had said this, he fell asleep. He dies. Okay. Chapter 8, verse 1, and Saul approved of their killing him. The same guy who was just holding the things. But again, this moment here where Stephen sticks it right back to the Sanhedrin. So all along the Sanhedrin has wanted them to say things, or clear answers, and Stephen gives it to him. Stephen tells it to him just like it is. Okay, he gives the history. He says, you have continually rejected Jesus, and it's too much for them to handle. They figure, we got to get rid of this guy, and we're just going to kill him. Okay, but that kicks off the next stage in the proto-church, okay? Whereas up until this point, we've seen this proto-church in Jerusalem, this group of believers getting together and learning their way around and how are we going to interact, okay? And we say that, at first they had the favor of all the people, but then it's like after Ananias, they didn't want to be. Getting into verse 8, suddenly, the powers that be don't want the Christians in Jerusalem anymore. Okay. And so with that, next week we're going to pick up there and we're going to talk about what happens to the church in chapter 8. Philip, Simon the sorcerer, a couple of other things leading up to Acts chapter 9. Arguably one of the more important, if not the most important chapter in the book. Talking about Saul's conversion. So again, went a little long today, but again, it is the longest sermon, and I want to keep these sermons together. I don't want to be splitting them up so that you get the point of what's happening here. Okay, so next week we'll talk about that. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again. Bye now.